You know, at the end of the day, we want to build wild cars that are incredibly enjoyable to drive. And you better be having fun. Because, I mean, I can't imagine anything more fun than driving some of the cars we're building these days.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. Greetings and salutations to all of you listening around the globe, and thanks for joining me once again for another episode, and I hope you had a restful holiday season. I had a great Christmas with family and friends, and also I've been taking some time away from the podcast and Instagram and all the other stuff to get after some of my own projects, mainly my 1931 Ford Model A Roadster, which I bought back in September. And I've told you about that on the show before. It was a runner when I bought it, but it really hadn't been driven for many years, and as it turned out, it needed some fairly in-depth work. It wasn't as easy as putting gas and oil in it and going, and they never are really, right? But Model A's are so simple to work on. It's actually been a lot of fun. And I have to admit, I'm not the greatest mechanic. I do okay, but in the course of recommissioning this car, I've been documenting it on the YouTube channel, and the next video is going to be up this week. So check it out if you're curious. Just go to Horsepower Heritage on YouTube. You'll find it. I have a few videos up on the Model A already, in addition to a bunch of other stuff. I'm going to do a whole series of videos on that car, and we're going to have some adventures in that thing this year. I can't wait. And speaking of YouTube, my interview with Ferrari stunt coordinator Robert Nagel has really done well over there. It just hit 100,000 views the other day, which is great because the Horsepower Heritage YouTube channel is a humble little presence in the great scheme of automotive channels over there, but it's growing every week. And you know, although people have mixed feelings about the Ferrari film, they seem to like hearing the behind-the-scenes stories from Robert. Got a lot of good comments on that video, very positive. If you haven't seen that yet, or you haven't heard the podcast version, head over to YouTube, take a look at it, tell me what you think. And Robert, I know you're out there listening. Thanks again for sitting down with me. That was a really fun day. Robert loved it, by the way, you guys, even though he drove about 5 hours, I think, back and forth to do the interview. He enjoyed it, and we were surrounded by a world-class collection of cars. He's a stand-up guy. Thank you again, Robert. And go see the film if you haven't seen it yet. Now, today I've got something completely different for you. If you like classic American muscle cars, but you also like resto mods, this is going to be right up your alley. My guest is Tom Porter from SPEEDKORE, a Midwestern maker of the hottest resto mods out there. SPEEDKORE takes things to a different level. They form full carbon fiber bodies and their own in-house designed chassis, and they conjure up modern MoPar dream cars. That's what I'd call them. The 68 through 70 Dodge Chargers are kind of their signature build. They've done more of those than others, but they've also done classic Camaros and even a vintage BMW, and you're going to hear all about those cars in this episode. Now, the other thing is, Tom has been a gearhead his whole life because he was born into a family of sports car fans, grandfather and father, and you know how I love family stories about cars? Tom's got a really good one that, in a sense, goes all the way back to the earliest days of what could be considered the American muscle movement, the horsepower wars, all of that. So I really enjoyed this discussion with Tom Porter. And while you're listening, check out speedkore.com. That's core with a K, and there's a link in the show notes. You'll see their cars on the website. Cool stuff. Anyway, thanks again, guys, for all your support. Onward and upward for 2024. I'm glad you're out there listening. And when we come back, it's American Muscle with Tom Porter of SPEEDKORE. That's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to ModelCitizenDiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. You know, Tom, there's just something about Wisconsin and car culture. Shout out to you guys. I mean, California gets a lot of attention for its car culture, but Wisconsinites really are into their cars.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a hotbed, and it has been since the late 40s, because in the Chicago area, you had most of the wealth that were, the socialites that were buying the early sports cars. But most of the immigrant mechanics were based in the Milwaukee area and in southeastern Wisconsin. They were servicing the cars just over the border in Racine, Kenosha, and Milwaukee. And you saw a lot of turnover of those sports cars, and often they were bought and purchased by the mechanics that were servicing them. This area has so many historically significant cars. It's astounding. But I think that spurred the current generation of builders or collectors and restorers. Mike and Jimmy Ring, SPEEDKORE. There's quite a few in this area. Up in Appleton, you have Motion Industries, a Ferrari interior and restoration shop. I mean, they're winning or placing and showing it at Pebble Beach every year. There is a real understanding and appreciation for maintaining cars and restoring in this area for sure.
Well, and there's also a manufacturing history with Nash, and then which became American Motors, being built in Kenosha. A famous son of Wisconsin, Harry Miller, who
absolutely
built incredible racing cars in the early days of Indianapolis. And so there's a great heritage in the state of Wisconsin, and now SPEEDKORE is a part of that.
Absolutely. We've been around for 7 years now. Seems like an eternity to us, but we're based here in Grafton.
Which is, you're just north of Milwaukee, right?
Correct. Yeah, about 15 miles north. And we have, a 35,000 square foot shop, and we employ 9 shop guys, from fabrication to composite to paint and body and mechanical. We build everything in-house. But right across the street from us is our parent company, and that's Capco Metal Stamping. That allows us an interesting position because we can be vertically integrated. We can design our frames, SPEEDKORE frames, in our facility, and we can export those files across the street to Capco, where they will laser cut the frame designs that we have out of 12-gauge steel. And then we bring them back over and we create fixturing, and we make our own frames. That's pretty unique in this era of pro touring builds. Most people will, source a frame from Roadster Shop, namely, but there's others out there. But
Art Morrison, yeah,
absolutely, you got it. And so for us to be able to build our cars from the ground up is pretty special.
You guys are at the forefront of technology. You're exploiting the latest technology in your builds, which is interesting because that blend of the classic muscle car, right? The look and the feel, the emotion of that, but also with the latest materials and design tech.
Absolutely. Blue light scanning and CAD development is pretty standard place now for most of the, what I would consider upper echelon builders. We've been doing that since the onset.
Tom, describe blue light scanning.
Sure. So when you want to create a frame, we would, as an example, we would take one or two good examples of say a 1970 Dodge Charger. We would strip the entire car. We would measure it manually, and then it would be mounted on a surface plate, where we would then bring in a large computer, powerful computer, and scan all the surfaces, interior, exterior, engine bay, And you're basically creating like a topographic map or a model of the entire structure of the car. From there, when we have two good examples of that, we can overlay those and we can make sure that the frame designs that we're going to put under these shells are going to be exacting to, a very high tolerance. Those data sets then allow us to develop a frame, develop the suspension locations, develop the cage. We build 3D print and design the dash and the gauge clusters and everything all around these data models. Allows us to put an engine in a car. We can see if it's going to fit. Where do we need? What kind of custom motor mounts do we need? Is the K-member going to interfere with the pan on a 6.2 Hemi or a 7-liter Hemi, whatever? All those things are things that we can work out.
So you're really building the car digitally before you ever swing a tool or bend a piece of metal or...
There's a lot of truth in that. The first ones are a little rougher, but once you've gone through the iteration process, on the second build, it's always going to be a little bit smoother. Now that we built a fair amount of, B-body MoPar cars, that aspect of it is relatively repeatable. We build 4 frames at a time now, and we shelve two of them, and then we work on 2 cars, next to each other. They could be completely different, but in terms of what they're going to end up being, but the frames and that process is repeatable.
Right. And I think it's fair to say that your secret recipe is a big honkin' MoPar V8 wrapped in carbon.
It is. I mean, we work with DSR, Doug Schumacher Racing. They provide us crate motors. They also build motors for FCA. They are the go-to for the power plants that we use. We've had the luxury to build a car with Ralph Giles, the head of, Stellantis styling. He penned the ACR Viper, last gen. So in terms of, what SPEEDKORE is, we have aligned ourselves within the MoPar, rank. That's where we want to be. It's what we love. We have a lot of guys here that are old drag racers. They live and breathe it. Yeah, absolutely. Those motors are the ones we want to use. We've developed a history with them, and they're the perfect balance of power at 707 horsepower and a 6.2. I mean, we're not using any traction control at this time. Future builds, we're considering that option, things like that, and trying to develop that. But right now, that's drivable horsepower as far as we're concerned.
By the way, you mentioned Ralph. He's one of the guys that conceived the Dodge SRT division, street and racing technology for people that aren't really MoPar folks, which it's interesting because Chrysler was married up with Daimler for a while. They saw what AMG was doing over there, and Ralph was like, yeah, we could have our own division like that within Dodge, and that's where SRT was born. So amazing performance coming out of that division over many years now. And I happen to know Ralph, and he's a terrific guy. He's brilliant, but he's also just a gentleman. Lots of fun to talk to. Eventually, I'm going to have Ralph on the show, but yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him. Good guy.
Yeah, he's great. With his creative prowess to, be able to execute on the build with him was fascinating. The design criteria, he knew exactly what he wanted, and we could FaceTime and he could walk around the car and say, change the hood scoop to this design and this shape. And it was a pleasure to work with the guy. He's just a consummate professional and understood us, and we understood him. And honestly, through the 6+ years we've been at SPEEDKORE, delivering a car to Ralph, and we met him at Gingerman Racetrack outside of Michigan. And, we show up with a car and it's got a set of radials on it. And then there's a set of, track slicks on another set of wheels. That's how Ralph is. He wants to be able to track this car. And he showed up with his ACR Viper and an Alfa Romeo that he's done some trick stuff with and took over the track for the day. But point I'm making is he is a driver, and he got in the car in 100 degrees and did 10 sessions in the car and did threshold braking and just really, really put this car through its paces, and we couldn't have been more pleased. The car just absolutely responded. It was great, and he's still enjoying it to this day.
We should mention it's a 68 Charger based car.
Yeah, it's a 1968 Charger with a early, I believe it might be Elephant crate number 001, which was really appropriate in the early production run.
Yeah, 1,000 horsepower, right?
1,000 horsepower, correct. Yeah.
And you guys tend to give your cars names, and that particular car was called Hallucination, right? HELL,
Correct.
Hallucination.
Yes. I believe Ralph's daughter or niece came up with a name for that car. Yeah.
No, it's
yeah,
good.
we sure do. We try to, pick up on the nomenclature and try to carry that from Hallucination to Hellraiser to a number of different cars we've done, Hellacious.
Yeah, and it's good to have a sense of humor, right? Like, you're not taking yourselves too seriously. This is all about fun.
It is. I mean, at the end of the day, we want to build, wild cars that are incredibly enjoyable to drive. And you better be having fun because, I can't imagine anything more fun than driving some of the cars we're building these days. So,
how does it work? Does a customer come to you with a car and they've got what you need is the VIN number, right? Because pretty much you're remanufacturing everything. So does a customer come to you with the vehicle and say, build me a SPEEDKORE car?
Yes. A client will approach us with an idea. Let me say, first of all, it's rare that we ever have inventory. If I had a car to sell today, I could sell it tomorrow. We're lucky. People are always looking for that. We get a lot of calls of cars available. So it ends up that we are primarily taking orders and building to order. That's a great journey. Most of the clients that I have, when we complete a car, they get back in line again.
Wow.
They want to get on the SPEEDKORE ride again. They love it's rare that you can build an American muscle car and have this sort of involvement in details of the car that we provide. It's a pretty enjoyable process.
So I take it you mean that the client is involved in every step. They're speccing the car and making, style decisions and tech decisions with you guys.
Yeah. So beyond what we've kind of discussed in the frame and the running gear of the car, they have options around the power plant, the transmission. Those would be standard choices. But when we get to the interior of the car, there's details that clients are looking for. They're very bespoke interiors. Obviously the gauge clusters, colors,
materials,
materials, types of seats, the effects in the car. All those are pretty much open. You can choose, we're not, when you talk about new technology, a lot of it is based in that area of the car. It's the interface between the client and the vehicle. So in Ralph's case, we did a front hinge hood for his 68 Charger. If you think of the engineering work that's involved with changing a hood to have it hinge forward as opposed to the standard, rear, firewall hinge, that's a great example. Custom wheels, we provide those options as well. So it's a fantastic experience for the buyer.
I've got to say, by the way, that your underhood detailing is so clean. It's difficult to hide wiring and hide systems. You managed to do that. You managed to make the modern engine the centerpiece, which, so many engines now are just covered in plastic and they're hidden, but you guys make it the centerpiece, which is, I think, how it should be.
Yeah. Again, that's evolved for us. When we did the Tantrum, that was a 9-liter, 1,650 horsepower, Mercury, racing QC4 engine. It's a packaging in and around. We had the headers over the top of the motor. It's an incredible, amount of time just to get everything to fit in the engine bay. But over the years, we've developed our engine bay kind of look and feel. Carbon fiber panels that, fit very, very cleanly in the engine bay. It works with the different models and the crates that we provide as an option. The nice thing about it is you can remove them, and accessibility is a really big part of why SpeedKore car is great.
Yeah, because you need to service them ultimately.
You need to, and you can take this stuff out. It's easy. It's thought out, and you can put it back in. And it's just, that's an important part of it. That is one of our most important considerations when we do anything. It has to be serviceable. You have to be able to get at it.
Right. Hey, there was another interesting build that you guys did that I wanted to talk about. We talked about Ralph's 68 Charger, but you built a car for Robert Downey Jr. And it's not something maybe people would expect out of SpeedKore, having this MoPar focus, but it's a BMW E9 Coupe, a 1974.
Absolutely. Robert's been a client of SpeedKore since early on. We did 3 different builds for him. We did a 70 Boss Mustang as well. Beautiful car, but the E9 was a fascinating project. We used an M series motor that we sourced locally here in Milwaukee, and it took quite a bit. There was a lot of customization that came in. Brembo helped us out with some custom brake pieces that we needed for that car. To get the suspension where we wanted it in a certain stance, there was some modifications we really had to do in and around the wheel areas of the car. The interior, completely driven by Robert. The choice of materials, it turned out to be a pretty darn nice little car. I haven't seen it in a few years. I'd love to lay eyes on it again. At that time at SpeedKore, I was working primarily in the composite side of the business and wasn't real close to that project, but it was definitely a change in direction for us at that time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Robert Downey Jr. turns out to be a car guy. That's pretty cool. And so this E9 is kind of an interesting, like a burnt orange color. It's clearly a resto mod. You wouldn't mistake it for a stock E9. I think that body shell really lends itself to resto modding. And most of those cars, by the way, are so rusty inside. Even a mint-looking car, there's a lot of moisture traps in that body, just by virtue of how it was built. They were built by Carmen. So there's a lot of moisture traps, and even cars from dry regions tend to rust out in certain places. So what I'm getting at is, if you're going to dismantle them and they need a lot of rust repair, why not resto mod it? I think it's a cool take.
It is. I love the stance of that car. When I think of SpeedKore, and I think, if you look at a kind of a composite of the different cars we built, you'll notice a certain stance. The wheels are big, the stance is lowered, but it's appropriate. You have full suspension travel, and that's one of the amazing things about the cars that we do build. You can go and performance drive that E9. You can performance drive the 68 that Ralph has, all of them. You can track day those cars and really, really enjoy them.
Yeah, that's really cool. Speaking of track days, let's talk about the suspension and handling performance of these cars, because yes, 1,000 horsepower or 707 horsepower, those are big numbers. It's impressive, but if you can't get that power to the ground and maintain traction and handle well, what good is it, right?
Absolutely. SpeedKore cars are using Detroit Speed front links, and we have our own developed SpeedKore 4-link in the back. We use Penske 7500s, coilovers, and they're nice and adjustable, large sway bars. And, that's really where it starts. From the design characteristics of the frame, I don't know that there's much more I can tell you other than when we design the frame, we want to get the mass as low as possible in the car. The current cars that we're building are using carbon fiber floors. In some cases, we have designed a center truss that hangs over It's connected in the center of the car, and it supports the entire weight of the transmission, allowing us to actually get the floors lower in the car, therefore creating a lower center of mass and making the cars handle, even better.
And I'm guessing that they're far stiffer than a stock 69 Charger or 70 CUDA.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we use a 12 gauge steel when we laser cut our frames. They come in, we convert a deck over to fixturing, and we'll create, like I mentioned earlier, 4 frames at a time. Typically, we'll create all the ladder frames, all the the rails, all the cross members. We'll pre-build all the cages generally, and that's just a product of efficiency. Like I mentioned, we'll shelve 2 of the frames when they're done, but we'll use 2 for the builds that we're working on at a particular time. In the process of building the frames, we will tack together 3 sides of the frame rail, and then we internally route our fuel lines and our oil lines inside the frame rails, and they're pressure tested, and then we cap those lines so that you are creating really a perfect environment, and it's a nice clean look, like you mentioned, in the engine bay. Running all the way through the bottom of the car. You never see, lines for the dry sump if you're running that, or any of the fuel lines.
Now, Tom, you guys didn't make it to SEMA this year because the next big project you're working on wasn't quite ready, but there's another show coming up. Am I right?
Yes, the Grand National Roadster Show in Pomona.
That's right.
At the end of January. And that's highly... It's the best show. I mean, for us, it's incredible. We've unveiled several cars there. We're honored to go back out there again and bring another nice vehicle to that.
What can you tell us about that particular car?
It's probably the best car that we've ever built in terms of fit and finish, and we're really excited about it. So that's probably where I'll leave it right now.
Okay. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's good. I can tell you it won't have the name. It won't say hellacious or have the name hell in it this time.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing that. I'll be out there at the show.
Okay.
So, and if you're there, we gotta say hello.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'd love to. Hey, I would also like to talk about your own car background. Have you always been in automotive professionally?
It's a good thing this is a long podcast because it's could be a really long story, but I have always been around road racing. Being in southeastern Wisconsin, we're just 45 minutes from Road America. And my family, for 3 generations, has been involved in road racing, even before Road America was there. My grandfather was a purveyor of nice sports cars and owned 2 300 SL aluminum body cars.
Wow.
At one time. Yeah. And, he, in 1949 bought a XK120 Jaguar from Hoffman, and my grandmother was put on a train to Hoffman Motors, where she took delivery of the car, drove it back to Milwaukee.
From New York.
Yes.
Wow. So
that was what you did in that era.
Right.
So my father, he was in high school on the east side of Milwaukee, and at about the same time, road racing in Elkhart Lake was taking off. 1950, 51, and 52, they were hosting road races around Elkhart Lake, and the Porter family had the 120 Jag. And my dad was in charge of preparing the car and getting it to Elkhart Lake. And in those days, you would bring the car up to the road race track, if you will, hay bale lined street, and you gave the keys over to what was called a family driver. And this gentleman's name was Don Warren, and he was an Air Force pilot and considered fearless. And that's the person that you put in your car. And they went out and they drove the car without seatbelts, and they raced, with shoe polish numbers, a sports car around the lake track. And your family then went out to the corner in your best tweed and you stood on the inside of the hay bales and you cheered for the family car. And you drank too much, but that was what you did. 135,000 people were coming to these events. It's hard to imagine how many people would overwhelm a small little hamlet like Elkhart Lake. I mean, it's astounding. But that's where it really started, with our family. At that same time, at that same event, my uncle Jim and my dad saw an Allard. And it was parked in front of a small resort called the Pine Point. And the car was sitting there and it didn't run. The transmission had broken, which is a common problem for Allards.
Yeah.
And so they took slide film of the car. And fast forward to 1969, my father had 4 kids, had taken on his grandfather's law practice, had graduated college, kids, right away after college. And in Milwaukee, there was something called the Milwaukee Hot Rod Show. And it was held at the Milwaukee State Fair Park, which is the home of the oldest oval racetrack, the Milwaukee Mile. But this event is held in December, freezing cold. I mean, just absolutely frigid. Well, he and his best friend at the time, Mark Daniels, they drove out there, and sitting at the Milwaukee Hot Rod Show was this Allard, but it was painted blue and cream to match a single-engine Cessna airplane that was parked next to it. And it had a for sale sign. And it turns out that the gentleman that was selling it was another guy from the Racine area of Wisconsin, just south of Milwaukee, about 30 minutes. And he was going through a divorce and needed to sell the car so he didn't lose it in the divorce proceedings. So Mark decided to tell my mother about the car as a surprise for my dad. My mom got a hold of the guy and she bought that car. And it's the same car we have today. And it's got a really unique history. It's one of 12 Allard J2X cars that was imported with motor mounts for a 331 Hemi. And Vince Granatelli imported 3 of them, either the fall of 51 or the spring of 52. And the cars came over, and this one went right to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, where Carl Kiekhaver put a Mercury Marine 331 motor in. And it has twin Carter 900 CFM 4 barrels. It's got a 42-gallon fuel cell, has a 48 Ford Pilot 3-speed transmission, a DD-on torque tube. It makes about 300 horsepower for a 2,200-pound car. And after the motor was in it, it was delivered up to St. Paul, Minnesota, to a guy named Eddie Jones. And Eddie had a small garage in St. Paul where he maintained the car, but it was an ice race car.
Wow.
It was ice raced. Yeah. It was super unique. It was ice raced at the St. Paul Carnival in St. Paul, Minnesota. And in that day, you didn't put studded tires on. It was even, it was before that process even happened. What they do is they'd go out and plow the ice the night before, and then they would come through with Bunsen burner heaters, melt the top layer of the ice, and then throw sand in the ice and then freeze it. And that was how you gain traction. And you actually raced other cars. It wasn't just you out there against the clock. So pretty fascinating car, but that same car that following July was down in Elkhart Lake being, it had been entered by Eddie Jones, and he had broken the transmission. And my dad came into that car, and we've had it ever since.
Very interesting.
And yeah.
I should just mention, for people who aren't familiar with Allards, Sidney Allard was an Englishman who was a car designer, and he was one of the first guys to put an American V8 in a small post-war sports car. And in fact, Carroll Shelby raced an Allard, among others. So a lot of them had a 331 Cadillac. Some of them had the Chrysler Firepower Hemi.
You're right. Absolutely. Shelby, racing Allards, and Zorro Duntoff.
Sure. Father of the Corvette.
Absolutely. I mean, this car was, they're very instrumental and influential to what you see in American muscle. And Kiefer is the kind of the grandfather of NASCAR. So he was in the Marine. It was out of a 300 probably, but it was what they had, but it was what would fit in the car. That's what makes it kind of a unique story. But
Tom, I was just at the Velocity Invitational in Sonoma, California, which is a terrific vintage racing event, and there were a few Allards there, so it's fun to see them go around always. And I haven't sat in an Allard, but I imagine it almost feels like you're sitting on top of the car, because as a driver, you are really sitting almost straight up, and you're kind of exposed. A lot of cars of the era were like that. The drivers didn't start to get low really until the mid 1950s in open wheelers, which this practically is.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the cars we describe it as, driving a high-speed hay wagon. I mean, they're just absolutely, there's tons of camber when you're sitting in the car. And then when you accelerate away, the wheels stand up straight. The position in the car is just so unique. They're a blast to drive. I mean, for the era, the J2 was a much more successful car. Sidney created the J2X because he wanted to fit in the car. That was primarily the reason. So he changed the wheelbase a little bit because he was a really big guy. And they were going to go to Le Mans in 55, which they did with the Le Mans body car, which they were with Tommy Cole. They were very successful there. But, the J2 wasn't going to be the package to be able for him to fit in it. It was an interesting era, especially, when you ask about how our family lineage, came through this. When I mentioned my father being having a young family, coming into a car, finding this one, buying this was not an exception. The guys in this era, in this area of southeastern Wisconsin, were young professionals that were doing extremely well. Many of them they might have been doctors, but many of them were lawyers or took over family businesses. And they were buying X-Works cars, Nart Ferraris, Aston Martins.
You mentioned the XK120 that your grandfather got, and very few people really understood these European sports cars at the time. And it was basically unlike anything being built in the United States. So, yeah, they were a different breed, weren't they?
Absolutely. My dad's dearest friend, Mark Daniels, that I mentioned, he had Maston Gregory's Jaguar Type C, number 015, and he had the sister car to it as well.
Maston Gregory, the Kansas City Flash, they called him.
The great escape artist, yeah.
Yeah, a Midwestern boy who went to Europe and raced with the big names and became a big name in his own right.
So talented.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Le Mans, fantastic.
That is the most exceptional car that, I ever had the opportunity to ride in or see or be around. There's so much influence there. It was amazing. I could walk out my door as a young kid and my father would say, be finishing a telephone call with Mark, and he'd say, I'll be right over. And we'd run outside and we could hear that car coming for like 2.5 miles, on a country road. And he was, wound up. The kind of resale market for some of these X-Works cars was there. With Road America just opening in 1955. It was only, 10 or 12 years old, and these cars were available. And these privateers could buy these cars, and they were street legal. They weren't just specific race cars. These are sports cars raced. And that's a really important determination, because these guys, we could go to this local bar. It was called Buddy Beaks. And I could remember going as a kid. We'd show up there and there would be 15 rare sports cars, from Aston Martins to Ferraris to Porsches to Allards to Jaguars. It was all there.
And those were the days when you could buy a car off the showroom floor, tape up your headlights, maybe put a different set of tires on and drive it to the track and race and then drive home.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was the formative years for me and for my brothers. My father, soon after, started racing in SCCA. He bought another really cool car. It was a 1967 Alpha GTA that was the under 2 liter Trans Am championship winning car of Horst Queck. And again, that car was right here in Milwaukee. It was maintained by a guy named Charlie Malika. And Charlie, the car was for sale. My dad bought it. And a guy named Ron Neal down in Wheeling, Illinois, was building all the motors for Queck and for that car. And we raced that car from 1973 to 1980 and got invited to the Road Atlanta SCCA runoffs, I think 6 straight years. And we never went, ironically. It was just too expensive. You know, my dad was pretty frugal. You know, he liked to prove the fact that he could actually qualify for the runoffs, which meant you had to race 5 or 6 races in your division. And then you had to go out of division and you had to podium, you had to get points. SCCA is a lot different now. I think you can enter 3 races and you don't even have to finish them and you can get invited to the runoff. It's a different world. But by the time the racing season, the runoffs came up, it was just taking a week off from his law practice wasn't going to be practical.
Sure.
But it was a lifestyle. It was what we did.
Yeah.
You know, my mom, she was in the car and she'd go and volunteer as a registrar at all the races. And it was a lifestyle we lived.
Now, Tom, do you vintage race the Allard?
I don't vintage race it. I bring it up. I'll do like historic reenactments.
Right.
I don't have a cage in the car because I think it's kind of
sacrilege.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't even say that. I just don't really like the look of it. Yeah. But I do have a 42-gallon fuel cell in it because I really don't want to wear, be engulfed in a drum of fuel.
Yeah.
That's a good safety precaution there.
Well, I bet that car is just a whole lot of fun to get out on your beautiful Wisconsin 2-lane highways in the summertime and just cruise it.
It is fun. There's so much power in that car. There's just no weight to it. As far as, the vintage racing, I raced a Sports 2000 for many, many years at Taiga. My dad was influential in starting that series, and he was one of the founders to homologate that class in SCCA. The Sports 2000 being raced over in Europe. It's a support series for Formula 2 and Formula 3. And a number of the same guys that I described to you already decided those are cool cars. Let's bring them over to the States. So they got in touch with Carl Haas down in Chicago, and they imported 5 Lolas, and then my dad imported the first Taiga. And they showed up at an SCCA race, and the rules were if you showed up with 5 cars or more, the SCCA would homologate that car into their rules. And so that was the beginning of Sports 2000 racing in North America. We still have that original 78 Taiga.
Very cool. All right. Well, listen, thanks for being on. Tom Porter from SPEEDKORE, and you can check more out. You got to look at these builds. Speedkore.com, and that's Kore, speedkore.com. Tom, thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Maurice, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. It is something I listen to regularly and continue to do so. And if you're ever in the Midwest, please come by SPEEDKORE. I want to give you a personal tour, and I hope to see you out at Grand National Roadster Show. We'll be out there end of January, early February. So we got a car to show you, and I'll let you get in that thing and check it out.
It sounds good to me. And you'll get a little bit of sunny weather. You get to thaw out a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've been blessed so far, but I know it's going to get us.
Oh, yeah.
I know it's coming. I know it's coming. So,
all right, my friend. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Maurice. Good talking with you.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Guys, I've got lots of great stuff planned for the podcast this year, but I would really love to know what you'd like to hear about. So seriously, drop me a line at horsepowerheritage.com. Go to the website, just click on the contact button over there, say hello, let me know what you want me to cover, and I will do it. Shoot for the moon, too. If you want to hear Lewis Hamilton on the show, I'll try to get him. You know what? It's amazing. Sometimes all you have to do is ask, and the greatest people will say, absolutely, let's do it. All right, have a great week. I will see you back here on Wednesday, January 31st for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.